This is Lisa Ray of Restorative Justice International. Today we have our Global Advisory Council members from around the globe, and we should have a few more joining us directly. We're here today to talk about Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and the use of restorative justice. We put out a statement on March 3rd of this year, of course, and it says the following. It's very short, but we weighed in on the Ukraine conflict and now war. Restorative Justice International supports the sovereignty of nations. When there is conflict of any kind between people or nations, RGI supports the use of restorative justice principles in response to those conflicts. Through restorative justice processes, dialogue is possible and is urged. In order to, to participate in a restorative justice dialogue, first there must be an absence of violence or threat of violence between participants, including nations. Nations are encouraged to use restorative justice principles whenever there is a threat to their sovereignty. Peace is possible through restorative justice. Through the use of restorative justice, the needs of victims of violence or their families or the families of victims will not be ignored. RGI urges Ukraine and Russia to engage in restorative justice principles at this hour. So we're going to discuss that today, our comments about that statement. And also, I want to start off by welcoming Dr. Jane Bolito, who's our newest member. So Jane, thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to have you on the council. And Jane is the Diana Irwin Chair in Restorative Justice at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. And we'll go around the room and talk about both your reaction to the statement, which I know you all saw. And like I said, it was put out early, given today is the 17th, St. Patrick's Day, but we put that statement out on the 3rd. So let's go around the room and we'll start with those who are up the earliest or latest. So that would be either Upnate or Jane. So Jane, I think we'll give you the award today. So why don't you start off?
Thanks very much, Lisa. Thanks for that warm welcome. And I'm really pleased to join this discussion. In response to the statement, I feel really pleased that a statement was put out. I think that, a lot of the conversations that we're having here at the moment are just around, the despair that we have for the situation. Obviously, I'm Australian, I'm living in New Zealand, it's a long way away, but despair for, conflict, for war, for the kind of gross atrocities that are happening. And then a lot of the conversations are around, well, but what can we do restoratively speaking about this? And then there's fear, we don't know enough, we're not there. Restorative doesn't have the power to tackle these kinds of global issues, and we go around and around on that. So at a bare minimum, I'm really pleased just for a statement to be out that puts restorative under that umbrella of peacemaking, and that it sits alongside many other tools and strategies that we have. Restorative is one of those mechanisms that is non-violent, that it's always emphasizing communication, listening, human dignity as kind of components of the way forward, even with really wicked problems. So yeah, I'm really pleased for the statement to be out. And shall I pass to Upnate now?
Okay, that's fine. And actually, let me say this too for the record, for those who will probably be viewing this when we release it. So RGI is an association and network of 6,900 members and affiliates, and we were founded in 2008. We've been very active on many levels of restorative justice and its application, but many often think that restorative justice just applies to crime between victims and offenders and only in the criminal justice system. But as we're talking about here, no, it actually can go far beyond the scope of the criminal justice system, and that's what we're discussing today. And RJI is, we have advisors that are here today with our Global Advisory Council, and there are 15 members of that Council from around the globe. Okay, great. And so Update, why don't you go ahead, the next speaker?
Yeah. Hello, Lisa and everyone. This conflict has shown that how interconnected we are, and whatever affects one affects all of us. The conflict which is there in Ukraine, of course, we had 20,000 Indian students who were studying out there and who had to be rescued. So it also has shown that the way forward to ending, any conflict, any war that is there, that it has to end in a dialogue, that has to end in peace. And here I would say the restorative justice principles are equally applicable in a situation of war and conflict, because whether it is justice, ultimately dialogue, that has to take place and has to move forward. Loss of human lives on either side is something that needs to be spoken about. So there will be a lot of stories that would be there, people who have migrated, and in India we had the partition in 1945, and similarly a lot of Ukrainians have fled as refugees to different countries. So there is a whole lot of trauma that is taking place, a lot of trauma which will require a lot of healing. And I don't think all of us, as concerned citizens of the world, and RGI as a family, we are all concerned for each other and looking in ways that how we can help in whatever limited manner that we can. It is a persuasive statement of ours, which calls for which calls for wisdom, sanity, and of course, I would say restorative diplomacy that needs to take place. And there is something in terms of speaking truth to power. I think that's important. So yes, you have the weaker and the strong and the mighty. And I think we should not shut our eyes to what's happening around. And there is that acknowledgement that yes, either party, and every time I think there are certain things that at our own level also that we can do individually and collectively. That's as RGI has an important role to play in that part of it. At other levels, I think, directly engaging and encountering those, because it seems to be a universal thing now, encountering hate and violence that we see around. So it's not only supporting Ukrainians, but I've seen that stigma even for the Russians that is taking place. So I think we need to be cautious about that, and in terms of not condemning everybody as such. So there is going to be pain on either ways of it, and that is, and of course, restorative justice is ultimately a broader social movement. We need to keep that in mind. And the humanitarian activism, that will have to be, really more visible as well, I think. And the common suffering and, the resilience that is going to be there, all those stories or listening is going to be very, very important for the healing that would be taking place. And I think here restorative justice is something that, shows the way forward. So that's what I have to say. And, we are there for you, whatever people are who are suffering during this conflict. And in some ways, we can all get engaged and we can all hear. If there is somebody who's, who's as a refugee or who has come back, so just listening to them also. I've just met one of the students, who had, and one volunteer who was there in Hungary and helped in the rescue part of it. So for them also, it's been traumatic to be engaged in this and just trying to reach out. So I think that's something that at certain level, we'll all have to, in whatever limited way that one can do, be engaged in.
That's very good, Upney. And you made a number of comments that I'll speak about later. Your comment about restorative diplomacy. We'll talk about that a little later, but you made some very good points. Thank you so much. So Ray and Vi, Donovan from the UK, why don't you go ahead and report or speak out?
Well, last week, when we couldn't make the meeting because we had to go to Westminster, just outside of Westminster, just outside the House of Commons, were two young girls. And one said, "Would you like a leaflet?" I said, "What's it about?" She went, "Ukraine." I said, "Are you from Ukraine?" She went, "No, I'm Russian." I said, "That's a strange." She says, "My friend over there, she's from Ukraine." and we're the best of friends. And what I love what she said is, I'll say it in her words, no warmonger is going to make us fight each other. She said, we're together and we'll always be together. We started talking about restorative justice to them both. And she went, I know a lot about, this is the Russian girl, I know a lot about restorative justice. I said, well, look, here's our card. Anything we can do to help you. We've got a meeting across the road. I'd love you to come over there, but they won't let you in because you've not been invited. So, and we're hoping she gets in touch with us. And if we can, we can get her on a meeting. Like, for a young girl, she must be about 18, 19 from Russia, give us hope.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not what and the media makes it look like. All the Russians are against each other with the Ukrainians. They're friends. There's a lot of friends in this area, and we need RJ to let other people understand it, don't we?
I think it's highlighted what's happened here in Ukraine and Russia. It's highlighted the fact that negotiators are probably not trained in a restorative way, and yes, they may know a lot on how to negotiate, but maybe not in a restorative way. And that's highlighted what made me think, well, actually, we need to do more training of those negotiators, because it brings something else to the party, it adds to it. And I think that needs to happen. And it's made me really think about the division that's been caused, of course, which Upneat you referred to as Russian families and Ukrainian families divided over this.
And families, yeah.
And the pain that's caused. And we need to bring them together in a restorative way, in a restorative practice way. And how do we do that? And so, yeah, I think it's a long-term issue that's going to go on for a long time. So many people want their voice heard. So many people need to have their voice heard on both sides and need to come together. And I think each one of us who have people like that living within our communities, this is something we can all pick up on. As you said, Upneat, people living, your students, and here we will have people coming back from Ukraine and also people living here for the next 3 years, possibly from Ukraine.
There could be,
they have a voice.
There could be what we call fear with something like this.
Yes.
Because I was in Belfast, well, outside Belfast, in a place called Newcastle in just in Northern Ireland, and I was talking to men on both sides of the troubles, and we were together in a room. And when we finished, one came out to me, and we were talking about restorative justice, and he said, "Right, I'm not being rude to you. Your son was murdered, but with us it was war. And I was to meet a victim tomorrow, so I shot your son. Not only me, but my family would be shot. Is that's the fear we live in? How do we work that out? And this could be what the same with Russia and Ukraine when it comes to this.
There's a lot of fear.
There's a lot of fear around, you know?
Speaking out.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Which makes it all that much more harder for people to actually speak the truth, as Upneat said. It demands that on both sides that we talk about the truth.
I don't know if you heard the news at the moment. He's doing what was done in the 1930s, maybe earlier. He's now getting people to turn against each other.
She's really awesome.
To spy on each other now, but it was on the news today. So if I say something against the government, I could be arrested. My mum might grasp me up, if you know what I mean.
How awful is that?
That's what's happening now. He's turning family against family, friend against friend now. So it's going to be very hard to try and get restorative justice.
But not impossible.
Not impossible.
Not impossible. You know, restorative is always possible. But it might
why don't you do this for those who wouldn't know your story, maybe if they just were watching this recording. Can you just tell your story quickly about your son?
Yeah, our son was attacked in the street by a gang of boys for no reason. It was a non-provoked attack. He was kicked to death, ran over by a car, and there were 14 boys and girls involved, but the police only arrested 3 because the witnesses only saw 3 do the damage. And 11 years later, we met them. We met all 3. Well, we met the first one 11 years later. In court, he said he was innocent. He didn't do nothing. When he met us, he said he was a 15-year-old coward. He murdered his son, our son, and he's sorry. The second boy we met about 8 months later, he didn't walk in the room. He ran in the room, grabbed hold of me, and cried on my shoulder like a baby. The third boy we met, he compared it to video games. He said he thought Crystal would get up like they do in video games.
Mm.
And that really shocked us. But you don't know this, Lisa. November before lockdown, we met one of the uncles.
Mm.
His son was attacked in the street just like Chris. He went looking for him to beat him up and maybe do more damage. But then he went down the restorative road and met him in prison. And he's now, I won't tell you the charity, but he's now a champion for a restorative justice charity. We met him and we speak on the phone quite a lot, don't we?
Yes. But it took us 11 years to fight for our right to do this, because early on, everybody said it's a murder and you don't go, no, you don't go doing that. You know, this is not good for you. But nobody ever actually asked us what our needs were. And this is the thing about Ukraine and Russia, isn't it? Nobody's asking them what their needs are. It's all
Everybody thinks
the
for you.
media and everything else going on, but nobody's actually asking them on both sides, what are your needs? What is the truth of these needs? What do you need?
And the most thing is, what can we do for you?
Yeah, and what can we do for you? So I guess for all of us to ask Ukraine and Russians, what can we do to help you? What do you think you need?
I'm just going to say, Lisa, they go on to
That's a powerful thing.
if they go onto our website, www.chrisdonovantrust.org, on the bottom of the main page is a link to a film. It's called The Absolute Truth, and they can see our story there fully on, which is better.
Yeah, and it's a powerful thing, because when you're actually asking someone, as you all will know this, what are your needs? What can we do for you? Then you're empowering people. So many people in Ukraine must feel so powerless with what's going on. They've lost everything. And so many people in Russia must feel so powerless. Those that really know the truth and can't do anything to help, or can't even speak out, they're also helpless. And they need to have the power restored to them, don't they, in some respects?
Good. Okay. Thank you so much for that. Thank you. And Austin, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, and why don't you tell your story briefly as well, when you're a victim survivor?
Good morning, Lisa. It's afternoon here in Dublin, so happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody. My dad was the chief prison officer in Portlaoise Prison during the troubles in Ireland, and the IRA shot him as he was coming out of the National Boxing Stadium in Dublin. He was international boxing referee, and the Irish Championships had been on that night. Essentially, he was the head of security in Ireland's maximum security prison, and the IRA were attempting to orchestrate breakouts, and that my dad was just one step ahead of them. And for 30 years, they denied they had carried out the attack. And I took it upon myself to try and, after I had gone through other avenues like our police force and trying to get justice the normal way, what I did was I through a series of media interviews and that, I called out the political leaders of the IRA. And I eventually got to meet with Gerry Adams, and while he tried to intimidate me at the meeting, and that I kind of what we did was we got him to agree to a meeting between us and the leadership of the IRA, and they brought myself and my brother away in a blacked out van up the side of a mountain to meet with the IRA leadership. And after 30 years, they admitted to us what they had done. Even though they did coax it in said it wasn't sanctioned, but that high level operatives from the IRA carried out the attack. I knew it had been sanctioned, and I knew who sanctioned it. And when I put that to them, they denied it. So we kind of got about 70% of the truth off them. I do think if there had to be a formal truth process, we may have gone a bit further, and we wouldn't have had the falling out we had afterwards. So, you know, I have a good experience of what I talk about is intergenerational trauma and intergenerational effects of conflict. I see my own kids and how it has affected them. I see young people in Northern Ireland. I have seen other people down here, members of our police force who were killed. Children of theirs have committed suicide because of the trauma and the way it has affected them. you know, I've seen just numerous ways that the intergenerational effect of conflict, and it's something that I think restoratively we need to focus on in this conflict, because this conflict just didn't happen yesterday or last week or the week before last. This is a conflict that has been simmering since the start of the Second World War, and it was never dealt with properly then. It probably hasn't been dealt with properly since it has been bubbling since Ukraine became independent. There was the Orange Revolution, and then there was the Maiden Revolution in 2014. So we had a lot of different, and it was all those conflicts were, you know, whether Ukraine was going to be pro-Russian or pro-European. And it's that simmering conflict that has gone on since, and it's intergenerational at this stage. And what happens when something becomes intergenerational, in my view, is people get more polarized, and the ideas and the thinking about who is right and wrong gets more ingrained in the second and third generation. And I really think that there needs to be some way that international restorative justice people can get in there afterwards and try and do something to stop the intergenerational effects of what's going to come out of this. Because if they don't, you know, if we have a ceasefire and agreement, we're definitely going to be back here in 20, 30, 50 years time talking about Ukraine and Russia again.
Yeah.
Because of the intergenerational effects of what has gone on.
Very good. Yes, that's very good, Austin. Very good points. Okay, and John O'Malley, you have joined us, and I'm going to have you speak a little bit later, but and have you unmute once I introduce you. But Peter, why don't you go ahead? Peter B. Collins from San Francisco.
Thank you, Lisa. My background is with wrongful conviction, and I've been involved with the Freedom Foundation at the infamous San Quentin prison for over 30 years now. And I'm retired as a radio commentator. I have a lot of opinions, and I have shared them over the years. And as I look at the picture here, I think it's important to be looking at ways to address this conflict in, you know, using restorative justice principles. But I also feel that we have a massive crime that is in progress right now. And so it's difficult to separate some of the issues. There's a great deal of propaganda that has been weaponized to create a justification for something that is clearly just flatly unjustifiable. And that's not to say that Russia didn't have issues with NATO, the European Union, and the United States, but to turn this into a military confrontation, to manage this conflict in a way that puts innocent populations right in the line of fire. These are not accidental attacks on apartment buildings and schools and hospitals. And so I certainly hear Ray and Vai's commentary about the people, Ukrainian people and Russian people. But the leadership, particularly in Moscow, is unrepentant. And so we don't have the threads, as I see it, at this stage to work with. Reconciliation requires an admission of wrongdoing. It requires what in the Catholic tradition that I was raised in, a firm purpose of amendment to recognize the wrongs that have been imposed in this brutal fashion. And we also need fundamentally to build trust between parties before any meaningful dialogue can take place. So I think that what we're talking about today is somewhat aspirational. Nonetheless, it's very valuable because in the middle of a conflict like this, it's hard for many parties, those who are directly involved and those who are, secondarily involved, to really get enough clarity to find a path to person reconciliation that might lead to a rapprochement between the nations and their respective leaders. And finally, I'd like to make a point about the need for American humility. The United States, in the last 25 years, has engaged in unilateral invasion of countries. We have bombed innocent civilians, whether it is wedding parties in Afghanistan or innocent groups of people who happen to be near the target of a drone strike. And as the US tries to find its footing while supporting NATO and also dealing with the power and influence of Russia, my feeling is that America needs to acknowledge its wrongdoing in past episodes and to approach this with more of a peer mentality than the kind of superpower sense of American entitlement and invincibility. And so I call on our leaders to recognize that the United States has to change its attitude and has to modify its policies and its it's imperialism. That's the word that we really have to acknowledge, and that these actions by the United States have consequences that lead a country like Russia to feel that it was being encircled by NATO, that the US and NATO countries had violated their promises not to expand NATO after the Soviet Union came apart in the early 1990s. And so just speaking as an American, I would not be so pretentious to speak for America. I believe that we need to recognize the sins, the crimes that we have been responsible for in order to foster any kind of meaningful dialogue that is based on truth, not on propaganda, not on spin and the kind of self-centered rationalizations that the United States has used so frequently and, in my view, wrongly in explaining its own actions of the past 20 plus years. So that is my opening comment here today.
Thank you, Peter. And Peter was a talk show host in San Francisco for many, many years, very well known to all politicians, actually. And I appreciate your comments. I've known Peter for many, many years. I want to then introduce Don John O'Malley. Don John, are you with us? Let me see if I can. There you go. Are you going to show yourself?
Yes, good evening here.
Yeah, and he's from Nigeria. Here we go.
Okay.
Greetings.
Yeah,
Good
greetings.
to have you.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here today, and I think my opening conversation so far will be that in Africa here we say where two elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. So what's happening in Ukraine today is the competition of power between Russia and the other powerful forces. And unfortunately, Ukraine is caught in between, and the ordinary Ukrainians are becoming victims of what they don't know. So when I joined, I saw Stark talking about how this issue has been there as an intergenerational issue. And I think just like Oxford House of Mediation in the UK said, that when needs are unmet, it leads to conflict. And I think need includes the need for power, the need for inclusion, the need for socialization, the need for recognition, and so on. So there is this geopolitical strategy, or the politics of geopolitics going on there that's trying to exclude Russia from what I have followed up so far, that Russia is not really happy about it and revolting against that to the detriment of the ordinary Ukrainians now. And I think RGI and other restorative justice advocates internationally really have a lot to do after this Russia-Ukrainian war, to go in there and try to at least see how they can look at the root cause of this, and to what extent possible can restorative justice be probably applicable to some extent would be very good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. So let me add a couple things and get your reactions to my comments, because many of you actually touched on these. But when I wrote the statement and you all saw it and then agreed to it, and Don John, I read the statement that we put out March 3rd at the beginning of this call. I talked about the need for restorative justice right now as to encourage dialogue between nations, between these two nations, but that there must be an absence of violence or threat of violence, and as we now know, it's war. So I'd like to actually talk more about the here and now and not the aftermath of this war, whenever that might be. And as we know, we don't know when that might be and how large it might become, in between which other nations perhaps. But I'd like to talk about that, about restorative justice principles being used now. And as Peter said and others, it's very hard to envision when there is violence and when there is propaganda and also just bombing, flat out bombing, right, between nations. But I want to go back and consider, and maybe those of you that are more aware of what the UN has done over the years can add to this. But the UN, as I talked to Dr. Sandro Calvani, as you know, from Thailand, he was with the UN committee called UNICRE, and for many years. And but I reflected back on the number of times that the UN has mentioned restorative justice and has adopted it. And it actually went back to 1985 in something called the Beijing Rules, and it was related to the administration of justice with juvenile justice. That's one resolution they put out. And then a real critical one was in 2002. And it was the UN Declaration of Basic Principles of the Use of Restorative Justice in Criminal Matters. And that was put out by the Economic and Social Council. And then there are others in other places, Costa Rica, Nairobi, and Liberia. And the thing that I would like to see, and as I had an exchange with Dr. Calvani about this, the UN and those that are involved in the diplomacy efforts right at this hour, they need to know about restorative justice, and they need to know that it can apply to war, and that we must not consider it only for criminal justice, the criminal justice system per se. So that I want to actually throw out and get us to discuss. So Don John, do you want to add anything to that as you hear my comments?
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. You are right. Restorative justice need to be applicable even in war. and large conflicts. But before now, to some extent, people just think that restorative justice is only applicable in the criminal justice context. Restorative justice, very, very suitable in war conflict and in very large forms of conflict, because restorative justice to some extent is even preventative if we get to the root cause of something that is leading to war or conflict. And so limiting restorative justice only to criminal justice system alone will be doing a disservice to the potential benefit that restorative justice can bring into transforming conflict and transforming war. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Other comments, Ray and Vi? And I'm mute.
Yeah, we just in this country, when we just got an all-party, restorative justice all-party parliamentary group, and we just found out at a meeting we had not got a minister for restorative justice. And maybe with the United Nations, we should have a minister for restorative justice on the United Nations speaking on behalf of restorative justice.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Because we need someone there who knows what they're talking about, if you know what I mean.
absolutely. Yeah.
Because we haven't got one in England, and we're just sorting out now.
You were just beginning to work on that now.
And I will say, in England, we do work. We don't. It's not just criminal work here in England. We do domestic work. We do work in the workplace, mental health. It's all happening now in England really well. It's taken off.
And already we're using it in hate crimes in local communities. So
That's right.
this is trying to get to the root of it before it escalates.
So we're taking out the criminals and the justice system and doing it into the community now. Not us personally, restorative justice.
And so, you know, I agree with Don John O'Malley that actually, why not? Why can't we use this to try and get to these root problems before it even gets to even worse? And you know, and even then, if it is, as we've got it in Ukraine and Russia, that doesn't mean it still cannot be solved. But what it will require, of course, is to stop the bombing.
Yes.
While
Before there is a dialogue.
It's not a bombing going on.
So what I'm saying is,
It will require that.
What I'm saying is, maybe as a restorative justice international, we could put something to the United Nations about having a minister or two ministers for RJ, maybe from a neutral country.
Maybe, yeah. Why not?
Well, you know, it's worth a try, isn't it?
Interesting idea. Yes. Austin, do you have some thoughts?
I didn't hear that.
No, she's.
Yeah, just I find it, you know, if we're focusing on the situation as it stands at the minute, as Peter said earlier, it's going to be quite difficult to introduce restorative principles at the moment, because, you know, you need to have one party or the two parties admitting responsibility for their actions. You need to have a situation where one party is prepared to, you know, accept that they were the wrongdoer. And, you know, there is no indication at the moment that Russia is prepared to do that. Russia has actually, believe it or not, quite a strong hand, I believe, at the moment. Because, and you can see the Ukrainians have actually made the first step by President Zelensky in saying that he would consider their position in relation to membership of NATO and neutrality, but he wasn't prepared to concede on territory. So he has moved a little bit, but I think the Russians, not the Russians, but Putin, and I think we need to differentiate the Russians from Putin in this. And, you know, I just think that at the moment, restorative principles are going to be very, very hard to implement in this situation. And I mean, the country of Ukraine has been left devastated, and there's going to be a huge amount of reparations would have to be paid to Ukraine to build that country back up again. And, you know, in a restorative setting, when this is finished, you know, would Russia be prepared to do that? You know, because again, they would have to accept responsibility, and I can't see them at the moment accepting responsibility, and that's a huge part of the restorative process, as Peter was saying.
And Austin, when you say that, I just think of your own life there in Ireland. And I think of the death of your father. And I
Yeah.
think of restorative justice and whether it's been lived out in Ireland and Northern Ireland. So as you speak, I just think of your homeland there.
Yeah, I mean, restorative justice, there hasn't been a restorative justice in relation to the conflict in Northern Ireland. But what has emerged in Belfast in particular is restorative justice in relation to crime and criminality. And it's quite easy to do that in places like Belfast, where you have small ghettoized communities. So you have Catholics living in small enclaves together, you have Protestants living in small enclaves on the other side of the city, and they can actually introduce restorative principles for low-level crime and things like that. But there's actually not a whole lot of restorative justice going on between the warring factions in relation to the conflict.
So I guess that's the same challenge that we're looking at now as we discuss Russia and Ukraine. And
this is what I'm
right?
talking about, the intergenerational effects.
Yes, and it seems too, and I'll have Jane and Upneat talk as well, but we're talking about the micro and the macro of the use of restorative justice, right? And personally, but also as we're talking about now, the possibility between warring nations. So Jane, Upneat, would either one of you like to respond? Jane?
Yeah, thanks. I quite like that way of putting it, talking about the micro and macro kind of levels that we're working on. And I agree with the other commentators that if we use a very kind of conventional idea of restorative justice, that's not possible or realistic at the moment. But if we envisage restorative justice as a social movement and we think about it as a philosophy and a practice with various components, those are the things that we can use right now in our everyday lives, wherever we are in the world. And specifically what I'm talking about is if we think about restorative, some of the core ideas of restorative are around truth, multiple truths, storytelling, valuing storytelling from the field, trying to find the hidden voices, giving space to those voices that are shut down, listening, really listening from the heart, accountability, responsibility, venting when we need to vent, sharing information, searching for meaning in all of this, because as humans we're so curious. Understanding that restorative is such a core thing in restorative is that we need connection, and even if we're not talking about Russian and Ukraine and kind of at that level, it's connection in terms of reaching out to people in our communities who are Russian or are Ukrainian or are affected, who have been through wars, and to start a conversation. So we can take the elements of restorative and use them anytime. And that's where I kind of feel most hope at the moment, just starting small at the local level. And, one day, of course, having hope for something much grander that could be many, many, many years away. Restorative is, you've got kind of facilitated meetings at one end, but you have restorative diplomacy, you have restorative conversations. There are listening circles, for example, which are just really focusing on that, that storytelling and listening part of the power of restorative. So all of these things can be drawn upon, and that's kind of what, I think is quite important, especially when we think about some of the ripple effects of what's going on, which somebody mentioned earlier, that, there's at the moment, of course, in Ukraine, it's about survival and the basic human needs not being met, but the ripple effects intergenerationally go on and on and on. And so it's just kind of thinking very creatively as restorativists about what we can do about those effects as well. So that we don't kind of have, been some interesting conversations about cancel culture, and if somebody's Russian, we're not going to, we're not going to listen to Russian music, and we're not going to read Russian books anymore. So I loved seeing recently on social media a huge number. It was over maybe nearly 10,000 members of a Russian universities condemning what's going on, coming together to say this is not the Russian people's view. So we look for those little pockets of resistance and pockets of restorative people working across the world and connect the dots, and that can be what we're doing at the moment right now, when otherwise we would feel totally overwhelmed and very powerless in the face of such power. Thanks.
Good. Good. Thank you, Jane. And Upneat, comments?
I quite agree with all the ones who've spoken, with both Austin and Jane, the way she's mentioned. So at the macro level, of course, we are helpless and we are powerless. We just can't do anything. I mean, even as a body like United Nations is into question that how effective it was. So that's one part of it. But yes, at this micro level, the steps that can be taken, what Jane has mentioned. So yes, those are the things that in a limited way, particularly in terms of support and in terms of listening and in terms of reducing the trauma of the survivors of this violent conflict. That's something that could be done. And it's something that I guess, I mean, we are all, what I say is we are all connected and we are all affected in one way or the other. And it's not something, of course, the story of a Russian soldier who breaks down, who didn't know that he was going to fight a war, is as powerfully moving as somebody who's losing their lives. And you just watch those horrific visuals day in and day out. It's extremely, I mean, so even for those who are not a part of the war, we are also affected by it. So in that sense, I mean, ultimately, of course, there are various types. I mean, there are various sides of the truth, and justice as such. I mean, there has to be healing, and healing, it doesn't stop as such. It has to start immediately. So that's one bit, and the support. And I mean, it was refreshing to hear from Peter, because, we all assume, at least in the countries that I live in and the region, that yes, America is something that tells everybody, and it's like a superpower, and the imperialistic, the approach that is there. It's that the humility that should come. That is a refreshing change, and I mean, from the other countries, I mean, just as an Indian, I'm speaking that yes, when we hear that side coming, so that individual citizens, it's powerful when it comes from there as well. So in a way that yes, we are all feeling powerless and we are all feeling helpless. At the same time, we are all people are taking actions in limited ways of helping one another, whether it's Ray, who's mentioned about meeting a Ukrainian, and in terms of refugees who would be coming in, particularly to the European countries. I think that will have a powerful role in terms of providing safe spaces, providing opportunities for listening, and circles of support.
Let me add one thing and get your comments on this. And it does go back to some of the comments that Peter B. Collins made. So because of my own background, that I have a political legislative background, I've run for office myself, I think of the politics of what we're seeing today. And it's hard not to look back at our own history, Upneat and Peter and the rest, on January 6th. So as all except for perhaps Jane, we had at least 2 meetings with this council talking about the attack on the US Congress, Capitol, and the insurrection that took place under our former president. So as I watch the news, as I watch history unfold, and I watch Putin and what he's decided to do in the Ukraine, and then I think of the relationship between Mr. Putin and our former president. And it gives me pause, because all these things, it's hard to not think that they aren't connected. We haven't seen where that goes, what that means, but I think it means something. And I've been in contact with a number of you about protests that have occurred around the world, in New Zealand and in Canada. And then we saw the truckers protests in Washington, D.C., which was much smaller. But let's talk about that. I know that's very broad, but at the same time, we're talking about leaders around the world that are authoritarian, that have that power, and that they're dictators. And how does that play in? And I know that's very broad and big, but as we look at what we do, and as advocates for restorative justice, we have spoken out, like I said, about January 6th and that attack. So any thoughts about that? It's a big, I know, pretty big comments, but I do think they connect. And we did put a statement out right after January 6th condemning what happened. And as we know, some have been arrested, some have been convicted, some have been given a little bit of time in jail, in prison, but that's not over. Comments, Peter?
Well, Lisa, I'm not uncomfortable talking about politics. I think at the base of it, though, I pick up on what Austin shared with us. And there's a great new movie out called Belfast, produced by Kenneth Branagh, that I highly recommend to our panel if you haven't seen it already, and to any viewer. And at the root of this is a form of tribalism. And we are seeing the authoritarian leaders, including Trump, really exploit feelings of tribalism, senses of victimization, and exploiting that to produce conflict, not to lead to understanding, peace, and a positive form of human evolution. And so this presents us with really significant challenges at a moral, political, and global level, where these forces have been unleashed by people for really obscene reasons. And so it shocks us. It shocks our conscience. It does, in some ways, leave us feeling powerless. And so to me, I think of, we now have nearly 3 million refugees from Ukraine. And it is beautiful to see how other European countries in particular are opening their arms and taking people in. I think of the need for harm reduction. And in this case, it's hate reduction. I don't want those 9 to 15-year-old children who've had to leave Ukraine with their mothers to hate Russians for the rest of their lives. It isn't the average Russian who is the enemy of the average Ukrainian. But, and this comes back to politics, as you suggest, Lisa, these young people will be shaped by these extreme experiences. And how do we help them process this in a rational and loving way to ultimately move forward? We're in the thick of this now, but Austin, you have the benefit of years, and also Ray and Vi, from the actual crime to the steps toward reconciliation. And so, I think this is a really valuable discussion, because we are trying to think out what needs to be done here to try to repair the incredible ruptures in just 3 weeks that have been visited upon the nation of Ukraine. And this will take so much time, effort, and commitment to try to move these forces that have led to the moment that we are in. And it starts with us as individuals to reject authoritarianism, to reject jingoism and nationalism, and recognize humanity and fight for that comprehension and really trying to change the forces from dictatorship to a much more pluralistic approach to running the world. And Upneat, I appreciate your comments. I do want to let you know that I'm an outlier here in the United States. Too many Americans fed by a corporate media really don't take time to reflect on the role of the United States in actually creating, if not, influencing the conflicts that occur. We are the largest exporter of military supplies, munitions, death machinery. And, we always call it defense. And what we're seeing, on the part of Russia now is no form of defense. This is bare naked aggression. This is militarism and a kind of relentless practice of warfare. And we need to start by rejecting that.
Yes,
And
yes, that's good, Peter. And I actually, I forget who first said it, either Jane or Upneat. John Braithwaite, who's very well known in the restorative justice movement in Australia, wrote a commentary that I think got out this week. I read part of it already. And he mentioned the need for restorative diplomacy as one point, and also the importance of speaking truth to power, which is really what Peter B is just talking about. And I think that's the importance of restorative justice now. So any other comments on this thread, Upneat or Ray? Ray, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, going back to what Peter just said about the young people. We were with a group on Friday night celebrating their 40 years of charity with young people. And their idea of bringing these young people now from Ukraine into Poland is to go over there and play football with them. That's their idea, bring them together. But that's just a sticking plaster as far as I'm concerned, because it's not really going. They'll be playing football today. Tomorrow they're moving into another country somewhere, say to England, into another person's house. Then, as you said, Peter, they've got to live through all that again. There's no helping them. It's just, oh, let's have a game of football. You'll feel better next day. But it doesn't work as far as we're concerned. Like you said, Peter, we need to get into their lives and try and change their thinking now. Because we're getting Ukraine 24/7 in this country, on the news, on talk shows and everything. In fact, one talk show host, he tries to change the subject, and if he goes, oh, we're going to speak about Ukraine for a minute, he goes, I know what you're going to say, not Ukraine again. That's what it's getting like now. It's getting, Ukraine's becoming a nuisance to this country on the news, if you know what I mean. I know it's a hard thing to say. It's a kind of brainwashing from the media.
So do you think it's about education?
Education.
Re-educating our young people.
Yeah.
And re-educating those young people.
And the adults.
Into some real truths about the real, how they feel, is to help them to talk about that. It's about that education.
Because there's people in Russia who's just as scared of what's happening as anybody else is.
And I don't know if you agree, in Austin, in Ireland, it's about re-educating young people as well.
So let me also direct you back to what we were talking about, the politics behind this, and also what I said in Peter about authoritarian governments at this hour as well. So comments, Austin, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I mean, where I look at it is a lot of the authoritarian governments have come to power on the back of populism. They have been elected, most of them. Trump was elected on the back of populism. Putin was elected initially on the back of populism, and he was seen as pro-Western when he got elected first. In our own country, we see the former IRA people in Sinn Féin are riding at about 30% in the polls, and they're looking to get into government, and they still haven't admitted responsibility for one iota of what they've done. And they're basically what they're doing is they're promising people you know, the sun, moon, and stars. They're going to cut taxes. They're going to give away free this and free that. Everyone's going to have a free house. And people are buying into that. I mean, I had a conversation the other day with a woman who was about 50 years of age, a very well educated woman. She was a psychologist, and she said to me, Austin, what other way can we vote if we want change? And I'm kind of going, seriously, you know, you need to think what you're doing. These people are, you know, totalitarians, they're autocrats, they're, you know, the first thing they've already indicated is that they're going to shut down certain sections of the media in Ireland if they get into power. And, you know, but they're riding on the wave of populism. And it's very difficult to get into the soundbite, because what we say when we want to open a conversation with them about what they've done in the past and how to talk about what they've done in the past, their answer straight away is move on. Everybody needs to move on from the past, but you can't move on from the past unless you actually address the past. And they want us to move on and just leave it, park it there without actually addressing it. And that's why I'm saying to you, I keep going back to intergenerational stuff. I keep going back to when conflict happens, we need to repair the damage almost immediately, or it's going to fester.
Yes, and we need to listen to the stories of the victims and the victims' families. Jane, you have a comment?
Just a quick one on the topic of politics, because I do think it's absolutely critical that, you know, when we see these examples of authoritarian leaders, dictators, people acting with absolute power with disregard to humanity, something that's very scary is when these kind of folk get together and there are alliances between kind of countries, and specifically, I suppose I'm talking about China, and that in the geopolitical sphere that, you know, we have to be so careful when we're balancing how we react to extremism, tribalism, and so forth, because as soon as you, and this is a core restorative thing, as soon as you put someone in a corner with no way out, no avenue out of it, they're going to be looking for other, they're kind of more open and vulnerable to other dictators coming on board and saying, yeah, what you're doing is fine, let's band together, which would be leave us all in an even more dangerous situation than what we're already at. So I suppose it comes back to that restorative diplomacy piece, which is that accepting that, yeah, there's a lot of politics here, and that restorative diplomacy is trying to open up some avenues for Putin to try and backtrack out of the very difficult situation he's now put himself in.
Very good, good comments. Yes, and the importance again of speaking truth to power for those of us that represent restorative justice, as we do here at RJI. Don John, did you have any other comments or update? Let's see.
That was John Braithwaite's. We can share that article on healing Ukraine with justice. It's a beautifully written article, and you know, you understand the dynamics of how this conflict has also happened. And you know, I was just thinking that all these authoritarian leaders seem to be learning from each other much more. This seems to be a universal thing in different countries, and there has to be, Peter would be in a better position to analyze in terms of how in different countries they have you know, been elected or chosen. But the damage done in terms of dividing societies and the hatred that has happened, I really don't know how you know, those divisions and those can be, you know, ultimately, I don't know, in American society, whether the Trump followers, you know, reintegrated back and in terms of having a more peaceful society. So that's something that would be a challenge, because it's easier to create divisions. It's difficult to unite people together.
Actually, let me just address that, and then I'll let John make his comments. But there was a poll that came out yesterday by Pew Charitable Trust, and I was surprised by it. It was showing that there was support for Ukraine on the left and on the right, pretty overwhelmingly. The question was, what were Americans in support of our government doing? And then there were differing opinions about how far to go, whether we should send in ground troops, et cetera. But the support was there, and it was clearly also coming from those who had supported Mr. Trump in the past. So it's very interesting. I think the politics here in this country at this hour is very interesting to watch, and it's changeable, it's fluid. So anyway, John, your comments?
When it comes to politics, I think contemporary politicians and our political leaders all over the world are making things really difficult for peace to reign, because most of them these days are getting to power using divide and rule. And sometimes they use this authoritarian kind of communications or so to cause these divide and rule tactics. And I think good that you have worked with politicians and you have been a lobbyist for some time. It will be good for RGI to sometimes create a kind of what we call like people are saying restorative diplomacy, yes, a kind of strategic communication from politicians, so that they should avoiding conflicts. For instance, I was just listening to news recently, and American president is already saying Putin is a criminal, something like that. It is true that Putin, what Putin is doing is not something that's acceptable, but already he's defining it as for International Criminal Court as a criminal. That kind of communication can agitate the mind of the Russian government to say, okay, if International Criminal Court is going to jail me because the most powerful country is saying that I'm a criminal, then let me go on committing more crime before they jail me up. So I think restorative justice, we have to really work with politicians so that they can come up with some of kind of strategic communications that we build peace rather than dividing people. Thank you very much.
Good. Okay. We'll have some closing comments, and then I'll make a closing comment. So others? We've covered a lot of ground here. Others?
I'll just add one point. We need to have more of working towards restorative cities. I think that's something that we can push forth, and that would lead to greater harmony, and it would combine with it would also combine with clean energy. I mean, there's the whole politics about whether it's arms or whether it's energy and all those things. So need to have more restorative cities.
That's a good point. Or whether we need to move away from fossil fuels and embrace renewable energy instead of Russian oil. Other comments, Peter?
Well, I would just like to say that I want to echo Ray and Vi's suggestion that something material that RJI could do at this time is call for the UN to develop a restorative justice element. We have high commissioners for refugees, for all kinds of human rights violations. And I think that this is a tangible outcome of this conversation that I would just like to endorse. And I'd also just like to follow up with Don John Amali's comments, because I believe, from what I've seen in the news coverage, that there have been significant war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. I also think that Professor O'Malley's comment that labeling Putin a war criminal does cause more problems than it solves. And one of them is the hypocrisy of the United States, because we're hearing, Biden use the term war criminal about Putin. Well, the United States is one of the few countries that is still not signatory to the International Criminal Court. And in fact, we have moved to sanction members of the court to harass them for their participation in pursuing potential war crimes caused by the United States in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya, and the US operates as if everything we do is legal, above board, moral, and would never fall into the category of a war crime. And as long as we try to maintain this exceptional posture, that whatever we do is okay, but when other countries do the same thing, we want them to be punished. We've got to come to terms with that. And
Well, maybe what we need in the US is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Peter.
we've got a
That's
lot
inside
of
the country.
we've got a lot of truth to exorcise, Lisa. That is true.
That's true, yes. And there are many administrations that we're thinking of when we think of our history and what we've done. Other comments? Thank you for that. Other comments? Austin?
Yeah, I just think we need to focus on the aftermath here, and you know, as Peter was talking there about Viv and Ray about some sort of restorative element in the UN, you know, through commissions and stuff like that. You know, I definitely think we need to formulate some sort of a submission or a policy on that. I definitely think that you know, truth commissions, you know, after the effect can have, you know, different, they can have different ways of being good or being bad, not working out the way people expect them to work out. So, you know, so you have to be very careful about what you do in that regard. But I do think that there needs to be some form of concerted effort by the international community to move in and to, in a restorative way, put the conflict to bed and not let it fester for the next generation.
Yeah, and I'm hearing that about what we can do as RGI. So I think we should look at what we might be able to do with the UN, what we might be able to suggest, and taking our statement and maybe expanding it a tad. Other comments, Jane, Upneat? No.
Perhaps just to support the earlier comment from Ray and V about negotiators being trained in restorative, and it goes to the UN point that there's an important, subtle, but is a definite difference between negotiation and restorative engagement, I suppose, and just to add that training into the mix could be useful. And, you know, I think all of us would wish to support America in, you know, seeing the value of the International Criminal Court. Yeah, I'm sure how to go further on that point, but you know, obviously, I think for me, working restoratively means supporting institutions that do value truth telling and holding to account, and the International Criminal Court is an example of that. So we will do what we can to support you on that mission.
Thank you, Jane. And Upneat, any final comments?
A little bit of an unstable connection out here I'm having.
You seem to be fine.
Yeah. So definitely a way in terms of strengthening at the international UN level. I do agree with that RGI should work towards that bit of it.
Good, okay, and then we got a message there from Don John, thanking everyone and RGI for this this meeting of our Global Advisory Council. Well, what we'll continue to do is we'll continue to be present and sharing our positions as advocates, and as we all are ambassadors of restorative justice, truly. The statement that we put out and on March 3rd, we'll continue to get that out. And also we've discussed actually internally getting that statement out as a petition so that individuals and organizations and entities that are part of RGI, that they can sign it. which we think is important. So it's not just inside this Global Advisory Council. So if you like that idea, we'll move on that. But I think we just have to be available and vocal in our support for the application of restorative justice, even during times of war, which is a new concept. That is a new concept, I think. And as we said with the UN, getting before the right people, and hopefully that's through many of you and inside the council, and also Dr. Sandro Calvani, who's got his own contact still with UN. So thank you all for being here today on St. Patrick's Day. And we appreciate your work and your involvement with RJI. It's tough to talk about this, but we're pushing new ground. And as we know how important it is and how much we're needed around the world. So thank you. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Lisa.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Lisa.
Thank you.
bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night, good morning.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Good morning.